thought I was coming home to dinner. I had been on my feet for 11 hours, my lower back aching in that particular way it always did on long Tuesdays. A dull, grinding ache that started somewhere behind my right kidney and spread outward by the time the afternoon shift crossed into evening. All I had been thinking about on the 40-minute drive home was the kitchen, the warmth of it, and whatever Jason had said he'd ask his mother to make. What I found instead was a single cracked bowl pushed to the far edge of the counter, cold soup the color of dishwater, 2 bread slices curling at the corners, and my mother-in-law, Eleanor, standing in the center of my kitchen in her pale blue housecoat, arms folded across her chest, watching me with the expression of someone who had rehearsed this moment and was satisfied with how it was going. "I don't serve daughters-in-law," she said, not with anger. Not even with malice, not the visible kind, with the quiet, unhurried certainty of someone reading a house rule from a laminated card. 5 words, delivered in the same tone she used to ask if I'd remembered to water her begonias, and they landed in the center of my chest like something dropped from a height. I didn't know then that this moment, this cold soup, this curled bread, these 5 words on an unremarkable Tuesday in November was the beginning of the end of the life I thought I was living. I didn't know that Eleanor had not come to stay for a few weeks while her apartment was being renovated, the way Jason had explained it with that particular half-smile he used when he was hoping I wouldn't ask too many questions. I didn't know that she had been planning her move into our home, not just our guest room, but our entire home, our routines, our finances, our marriage, for much longer than either of them had led on. I didn't know any of that yet. I was just tired and hungry, staring at cold soup, trying to understand what had just been said to me. That was 8 months ago. I know everything now. Our house was the kind of house I had always wanted and spent 6 years saving for mostly on my own. A 1940s craftsman bungalow on a quiet street in the east part of the city, with original oak floors that creaked in a specific musical sequence when you walked from the hallway to the kitchen, and a deep front porch with 2 wooden chairs that caught the afternoon light in a way that made the whole neighborhood look like a painting. I had found it, made the offer, negotiated the price, and signed the papers. Jason had contributed his share of the down payment. He always said his share in a way that made it clear he was aware the shares were not equal. But it was my credit history, my savings account, my decade of careful living that had made the purchase possible. The house was mine in the way that certain things become yours, not because of a piece of paper, but because you built yourself around them. I had a job I had climbed into slowly and determinedly, senior project coordinator at an infrastructure consulting firm, the kind of role that sounds dry when you explain it at dinner parties, but pays well and comes with genuine responsibility. I loved the precision of it. I loved that problems had solutions, that timelines could be managed, that with enough attention and care, things worked. I was 31 years old, and I felt, for the first time in my adult life, like I had arrived somewhere solid. Jason and I had been married for 3 years, and together for 2 before that. He was kind in the ways that matter at the beginning, warm, attentive, quick to laugh, the kind of person who remembered that you liked your coffee with oat milk and brought you one on Saturday mornings without being asked. He worked in sales, did reasonably well, traveled sometimes for work. We had a comfortable rhythm. We cooked together on Sundays, took walks in the evening when the weather was right, argued occasionally about small things, and made up easily. It wasn't a passionate marriage, I knew that, but it was steady, and I had come to prefer steadiness to passion. Passion burns, steadiness holds. Eleanor was a complication I had learned to manage. She lived 40 minutes away in a 2-bedroom apartment in a suburb that she described, without irony, as the wrong side of the city. She called Jason every day, sometimes twice. She had opinions about everything, our furniture arrangement, my cooking, the neighborhood we lived in, the fact that I worked such long hours in a tone that made it clear she thought this was a personal failing rather than a professional achievement. but she kept her opinions mostly in the register of implication, the passive-aggressive whisper rather than the direct accusation, and over time, I had developed a practiced numbness to her. You learn to smile at the comment about how Jason used to eat better before. You learn to let slide the observation that the house could use a woman's touch, said while you were standing in the house you owned, having just spent a weekend cleaning it. You did what you had to do to keep the peace, because the peace mattered, and because Jason always looked so visibly relieved when you kept it. She had come to stay in the second week of October, arriving with 4 large suitcases and a box of what she called essential kitchen items, which turned out to include a cast-iron skillet, 2 ceramic mixing bowls, and a laminated photograph of Jason as a 7-year-old that she installed on the refrigerator with a magnet she brought for the purpose. The renovation of her apartment, Jason explained, would take 4 to 6 weeks. He said it the way you say something you have already decided the other person will agree to. I remember standing in the hallway watching her carry the 4th suitcase up the stairs, thinking, 4 to 6 weeks. I can do 4 to 6 weeks. The first week was uncomfortable, but manageable. Eleanor rearranged the spice cabinet on the second day. "Just organizing," she said, in a tone that suggested my previous organization had been a form of mild incompetence, and replaced the dish soap with a brand I didn't recognize and didn't like. She moved the dish rack to the other side of the sink. She began cooking dinner every night, which might have seemed like a kindness if not for the way she did it, silently, efficiently, with the air of someone reclaiming territory. She set the table for 2, not 3, 2. When I mentioned it the first time, gently, she said she assumed I would be working late. I had not told her I would be working late. I had not been working late. Jason said nothing. He sat down at the table for 2 with his mother and passed her the salt, and I heated up leftovers from the night before, standing over the stove, telling myself it was fine. It was only the second day. It would settle. It did not settle. It calcified. By the 3rd week, a pattern had established itself with the precision of something designed. Eleanor cooked every evening, elaborate, time-consuming meals that filled the kitchen with smells that were unquestionably delicious, and that I was, without exception, not invited to share. She set the table for 2. She and Jason ate together, talked about people and places from a shared past that I had no access to, laughed at references I didn't understand. I came home, sometimes at 6, sometimes at 7, once at 8:30 after a particularly brutal project deadline, and found them finishing, the table being cleared, the kitchen warm and fragrant and entirely closed to me. The first time she said it directly was that Tuesday in November, but she had been saying it for weeks in every way that didn't require words. I noticed other things in those weeks, small things I cataloged without fully understanding what I was cataloging. She asked about the house, the mortgage, the terms, whether we had refinanced recently. In the careful, oblique way she had of approaching topics she wanted information about without appearing to want information. "Is the interest rate on these old houses always so high?" she asked once, sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of tea, her eyes moving around the room in a way I couldn't quite read. I said I wasn't sure what she meant. She smiled. "Oh, nothing. I just wonder sometimes if it's practical, for young people." She asked about my salary twice in the span of 10 days. Not directly. Eleanor never did anything directly. But in the way of someone triangulating, a comment about the cost of our neighborhood, a remark about how much project coordinators must make these days, a question addressed to Jason about whether our situation was stable. I heard Jason say in a low voice I was not meant to hear but did, standing in the hallway with my coat half on, "She does well. The house is in good shape." And then something I couldn't make out, and then Eleanor's voice, quiet and even, "Good. That's good to know." I told myself I was reading too much into it. I told myself she was an anxious woman with nothing to occupy her mind, and I was projecting. I told myself a lot of things in those weeks, and I believed most of them because the alternative, that there was a plan, that the 4 suitcases and the cast iron skillet and the laminated photograph were not the belongings of a woman renovating her apartment, but the advance equipment of an occupation, was something I could not yet afford to believe. Jason had grown quieter in a specific, directional way. Not sad, not distant in the manner of someone troubled by something unrelated to you, but careful, like a person navigating a room in the dark, placing each word where they were sure it would hold weight. When I tried to talk to him about the dinners, about the table set for 2, about Eleanor's questions, he listened with the expression of a man waiting for the conversation to end. "She doesn't mean anything by it," he said once, twice, 8 times in different arrangements of the same words. "She's just set in her ways. She's from a different generation. She's been through a lot." He never specified what she had been through. He said it like a password that was supposed to open a door I kept failing to walk through. The evening of the cold soup, I had been at work since 7 in the morning. We were in the final phase of a major project, the kind of deadline that doesn't negotiate, and I had eaten a granola bar for lunch and forgotten about it. I drove home with the radio off, too tired even for noise, thinking about the shower I would take and the food I would eat and the way the oak floors sounded in the evenings when the house settled. I came through the back door, the kitchen door, and the smell hit me immediately. Something rich and slow-cooked, onions and herbs and the deep, round warmth of a pot that had been going for hours. My stomach contracted with longing. I set down my bag and looked around the kitchen. The table was cleared. The dishes were done. The pot sat on the stove, lid on, still faintly warm, and on the counter, pushed to the far edge, where the light barely reached, was a small cracked bowl. The one we had used for the dog before we'd given him to Jason's coworker 2 summers ago, containing something pale and thin that I identified after a moment as potato peel soup. Beside it, 2 slices of bread that had been left uncovered long enough to harden at the edges. Eleanor was standing at the sink, rinsing a glass that was already clean, watching my reflection in the darkened window above the faucet. I looked at the bowl. I looked at her reflection. I said very carefully, "Did something happen with dinner?" She turned from the sink and looked at me with the expression she used when she wanted to appear to be delivering unfortunate but necessary information. "We ate at 7, she said. "I don't know your schedule. I can't keep food warm for everyone." "I texted Jason at 6, I said. "I told him I'd be home by 8. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in her expression. Not guilt, not anything so human as that, but the micro-adjustment of someone recalibrating a script. "Jason was tired," she said. "He went to bed early." I stood there in my coat in my own kitchen, smelling the lingering warmth of a meal I had not been invited to, looking at a cracked bowl that had once belonged to a dog. There was a moment, I remember it with a physical clarity, the way you remember the sensation of a very cold thing, where I simply could not locate any adequate response. Not anger, not tears, not words, just the specific quality of a silence that means something has shifted and you do not yet know how far. "I see," I said. "You should have come home earlier," Eleanor said, and she said it so gently, with such practiced maternal softness, that for a split second it almost sounded like advice. "I don't serve daughters-in-law. That's not something I do. You have hands. You can feed yourself." She set the rinse glass in the drying rack, dried her hands on the dish towel she had replaced mine with. Hers was yellow, with small embroidered flowers, and walked past me out of the kitchen without hurrying. I stood at the counter for a long time. The soup was cold. The bread was stiff. The house, my house, smelled of someone else's cooking. I didn't go to bed angry that night. I went to bed calculating. I found Jason in the bedroom, not asleep as Eleanor had claimed, but sitting up against the headboard with his phone, scrolling through something he tilted slightly away from me when I came in. I noticed that. I filed it away. That small, reflexive tilt, the way you file a thing when you don't yet have a folder to put it in. I sat on the edge of the bed and told him, in a quiet, even voice, exactly what had happened in the kitchen. I described the bowl. I described the bread. I told him what she had said, word for word, because I had the kind of memory that holds on to insults with particular fidelity. He listened with his eyes on the middle distance. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment that stretched past comfortable, and then he said, "She doesn't mean it the way it sounds." "How does she mean it, Jason?" "She's from a different time," he said. "She has her own way of doing things. She's not trying to be cruel, she grew up differently. Her mother ran the house and her husband's family stayed out of it. It's just how she thinks." "Jason," I said, "she put my food in the dog bowl." "It's not the dog bowl. It's the bowl we used for barley." He set his phone face down on the nightstand, and I noticed that too, the careful, deliberate face-down placement, and looked at me with an expression I had seen 100 times and had always read as weariness, but was beginning to wonder if I had been reading correctly all along. He started. "Can we just get through the next few weeks? The renovation is almost done. She'll be gone by December." "It's already November 23rd, I said. "I know. A couple more weeks. Can you try to be patient? For me?" I looked at him. My husband, the man who used to bring me oat milk coffee on Saturday mornings and who now slept with his phone face down on the nightstand, the man who had not once in 3 weeks set the table for 3. "Fine," I said. "A couple more weeks." I turned off my bedside lamp and lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around me. The familiar musical creak of the oak floors, the sound of Eleanor moving in the guest room above. She had taken the upstairs guest room, which meant I heard her every time she got up in the night, which was twice, reliably, at 2 and at 4, like a clock I had not chosen to install. I lay there counting her movements and telling myself I was being patient and reasonable, and that in a couple of weeks this would all be a story I'd tell at dinner parties with exasperated fondness. I was wrong about everything. I just didn't know it yet. I fell asleep to the smell of someone else's cooking still hanging in the air of my own home, and I dreamed of nothing, which was its own kind of warning. The next morning was a Saturday, and I woke to the sound of voices downstairs. Jason's voice, low and even, and Eleanor's brighter and more animated than I had ever heard it. Not the careful, measured Eleanor of the kitchen, but someone genuinely pleased about something, the kind of pleased that comes from a conversation going exactly as you hoped it would. I lay still and listened, but the words didn't carry, only the shapes of them, the rhythm of an exchange that had the quality of something rehearsed, something arrived at after prior preparation. I got up and made noise coming down the stairs, the way you do when you want people to know you're coming, and by the time I reached the kitchen doorway, the voices had adjusted. Quieter, further apart. Jason at the coffee maker and Eleanor at the table with a notepad open in front of her that she closed when she saw me. I noticed the notepad. I noticed the closing of it. The precise, unhurried way she laid her hand flat across it, the way you'd cover something you wanted to keep covered. I poured my coffee and stood at the window looking out at the backyard, at the oak tree that had been there since before the house was built, and I asked, with my back to them, in the same easy voice I used for ordinary questions, "What are you two working on?" A pause, the length of a considered breath. "Nothing," Jason said. "Mom was just making a list." "A list of what?" I asked. "Grocery things," Eleanor said. Her voice was warm and incurious, the voice of someone who has nothing to hide. "I like to plan my meals for the week. You know how I am." I knew how she was, but I didn't know yet about the list. I would find out about the list. I would find out about a great many things, and when I did, I would remember this Saturday morning. My coffee, the oak tree in the gray November light, the flat of Eleanor's hand against the closed notepad, and understand that the plan had been in motion long before I began to suspect there was a plan at all. That morning, I left the house at 10 to meet my friend Diana for a walk and coffee, the way we did most Saturdays when neither of us had other obligations. Diana was my oldest friend. We had met in college, had stayed close through marriages and moves and the particular attrition of adult life that thins out friendships without warning. And she was the kind of person who listened without interrupting, and who had never once told me that my feelings were an overreaction. I told her about the bowl. I told her about the bread, and Eleanor's 5 words delivered to my reflection in the darkened kitchen window, and the table set for 2 every single night for 3 weeks. I told her about the notepad and the face-down phone and the way Jason said, "She doesn't mean it the way it sounds," in the tone of someone who has repeated a thing so many times it has lost all its structural integrity. Diana listened without interrupting. When I finished, she wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and looked at me for a long moment before she said, "How long has she actually been there?" 3 weeks, I said. "And when does the renovation finish?" I hesitated. "Jason says December." "Have you seen any proof of the renovation?" The question landed differently than she probably intended. I opened my mouth to say, Of course there were permits, a contractor, a timeline, photographs of work in progress," and then stopped. Because I had not seen any proof of the renovation, not a single contractor's estimate, not a permit, not a photograph of scaffolding or bare walls or anything that constituted evidence of an apartment being torn apart and put back together. I had not been to Eleanor's apartment once since she had arrived. I had taken Jason's word for it, the way I took his word for most things involving his mother, because it was easier, because I had chosen again and again to believe that he was telling me the truth about things that mattered. "I haven't," I said. The words felt strange in my mouth. Diana said nothing. She looked at me with an expression that was not alarm. Diana was not an alarmist, but something more careful than that. Watchful. The expression of someone who sees a shape in the water and is deciding whether to name it. "Probably nothing," I said, because I needed to say it. "Probably," she said, because she was a good enough friend to let me have it. We changed the subject, but on the drive home I found myself thinking about the notepad, about the sound of Eleanor's voice that morning, that bright, satisfied brightness that I had never heard from her in 3 weeks of daily proximity. And I thought, what kind of grocery list makes a person sound like that? I didn't find out that day or the next. It would take 11 more days, a locked filing cabinet with an unlocked drawer, and a manila folder I was never supposed to find, to understand what had been happening in my house, in my kitchen, at my own kitchen table, while I had been patient and reasonable and telling myself that in a couple more weeks it would all be over. I was right about one thing. It would all be over. Just not in the way I had imagined. The folder was not hidden well. That was the thing I kept coming back to later. Not that I had found it, but that it had been left where I could find it, as if Eleanor had become so certain of my passivity, so thoroughly convinced by weeks of my tolerance, that she had stopped bothering to be careful. It was a Thursday in December, and I had taken a half day for a migraine that had been building since Tuesday. I came home at noon to an empty house, Eleanor at her book club, Jason at work, and lay on the couch with a cold cloth over my eyes until the pain eased enough to think. Then I went to the study to find chamomile tea from the shelf of the built-in bookcase. The shelf had been rearranged. My books shifted, pushed to one side, the way you move things when making space for something else. Behind a row of reference volumes I rarely opened was a thick manila folder, accordion folded at the sides to accommodate what was inside. My hands were perfectly steady as I took it down. That was the strangest thing. Inside were 4 documents. The first, a detailed financial assessment of the house, comparable sales, estimated market value, and a section titled Projected Equity Distribution that showed my home split into 2 cash portions, Jason's and mine, with meticulous calculations. The second, A 2-page letter in Eleanor's looped handwriting, addressed to no one. It began, "The situation is more advantageous than I originally thought." She wrote about Jason's equity, about what it would be worth if transferred to her, about a plan she called the arrangement. She wrote about my salary. She'd apparently researched it. And then the sentence that stopped the world. She earns enough that losing the house won't be a catastrophe for her, and Jason needs a foundation to rebuild from. She wrote about me in the third person throughout. Not a wife. A problem being solved. The third document was a quitclaim deed. Unsigned but fully prepared. Property address. Jason as grantor. Eleanor as grantee. A blank notary section at the bottom. Heavy legal-grade paper, prepared by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The fourth document was a timeline, handwritten bullet points on a single sheet. October 12th, arrive, establish presence, assess asset. December 1st, present arrangement to Jason, finalize deed. December 20th, file at county recorder. Today was December 11th. I stood in the study while two realities ran simultaneously in my mind, the one I had been living in and the one now revealed. Outside, the oak tree was bare and perfectly still in the cold afternoon. Jason needs a foundation to rebuild from. Not Jason and Sarah, not my son and his wife. Just rebuild, as if I were terrain to be cleared rather than a person to be spoken to. I photographed every document, every page, the folder itself, the arrangement of books that had concealed it. Then I replaced everything exactly as I had found it and called Diana from the kitchen while the kettle boiled. "I need the best real estate attorney, you know," I said. "Tonight." She didn't ask why. "Give me an hour." Patricia Halverson had an office downtown that smelled of coffee and the particular quiet of places where people arrive after things have gone wrong. I was there at 3:30, still in my work clothes, and I showed her the photographs on my phone. She scrolled through them without hurrying, her expression moving from focused attention to something more alert, before settling into the stillness of a professional arriving at a clear conclusion. "The deed is unsigned," she said. "Nothing has been filed. The timeline says December 20th. Then you have 9 days and a significant advantage." She looked at the timeline photograph again. "Has your husband asked you to sign anything recently?" "No." "Any unusual activity in shared accounts?" I pulled up our home equity line of credit. There had been a draw of $8,000, 11 days ago. I had not made it. The loan agreement required both signatures for draws over $5,000. Patricia looked at the screen. I turned toward her and said, "I need photographs of your original mortgage, your deed, and the equity line agreement. Tonight. Don't discuss any of this with your husband yet. Can you do that?" "Yes," I said. She told me everything else I needed to do. I listened to every word. I was home by 5:30. Jason arrived at 6 with takeout. Eleanor came downstairs looking perfectly well despite the text she'd sent claiming illness. Jason set out 3 plates this time, a performance of normalcy that now read as exactly that. I ate. I said almost nothing. I watched them in their easy, practiced rhythm and felt the months of cold soup and silent dinners and tables set for 2 condense into something that was no longer grief or confusion, but something colder and far more useful. Clarity. The kind that arrives when you stop waiting for the truth and start collecting it yourself. That night, I photographed the documents Patricia needed and sent everything to her. I did not sleep. 2 days later, on a Saturday morning with Jason at the gym, I came into the kitchen and sat across from Eleanor at the table where she was writing in her notepad as if she owned the morning. I placed my phone between us, open to the photograph of the quitclaim deed. She looked at it, then at me. For 1/2 second, the mask shifted. Not fear, not guilt, but the expression of a chess player registering an unexpected move. Then it settled again. "I don't know what that is," she said. "It's a quitclaim deed," I said. "Your name is grantee. My husband's as grantor, prepared to transfer my house to you. I found it in your folder in my study." "You went through my things," she said. The audacity was almost impressive. Patricia had warned me she might say exactly this. "Eleanor," I said, keeping my voice very quiet, "you put your things in my home without my permission and have been living here for 2 months while planning to steal my property. I don't think you're positioned to discuss whose things belong where." She folded her hands on the table. That measured, deliberate gesture. "Jason has a right to his portion of this house. I was helping him explore his options." "You were preparing a fraudulent deed," I said. "And the $8,000 from our equity line, the one that requires both our signatures for draws over $5,000? That minute recalibration again behind her composed face. "Jason authorized that." "He didn't have the right to do so unilaterally," I said. "I have the loan agreement. Patricia Halverson has a copy. The county recorder has been notified of a potential fraudulent filing on this property, and I have photographs of everything." The kitchen went very quiet. The refrigerator hummed. The oak tree outside stood bare and still. "We're family," Eleanor said. "I know," I said. "That's why this is so clear." I stood up, took my coffee, and walked out of the kitchen. Behind me, she said nothing, which was, finally, the right answer. Jason came home at noon. I was waiting in the living room. When he walked in and saw my face, he stopped the way people stop when they recognize the shape of what's coming. I showed him the photographs. I showed him the letter where his mother described me as a problem to be managed and him as someone who needed to rebuild. I watched his face move through surprise, the kind worn by someone less surprised than they wanted to appear, and then something closer to despair. "Did you know about the deed?" I asked. He looked at the floor. "The equity draw?" Silence. "Jason." My voice was steady in a way that surprised me. "I'm not asking to punish you. I'm asking because I need to know how much of the last 2 months was a performance." He looked up. His eyes were wet. "She said it would be temporary," he said. "She said she just needed security. I didn't think she'd actually file anything." "You let her move into our home," I said. "You let her serve me scraps and set the table for 2, every night, for weeks. You knew. You chose silence every single time." I paused. "She is your mother. I understand that. But this house is mine, and that's exactly why I'm not the one who ends up with nothing." He opened his mouth, closed it. I asked him to leave for the weekend. Eleanor was gone by Sunday. The formal notice from Patricia documenting the prepared deed, the unauthorized equity draw, and the timeline arrived Monday morning. Eleanor denied everything through the single phone call she made to Jason. Claimed I had fabricated the documents, a position that collapsed immediately given the photographs, metadata, and her own handwriting. The bank, presented with the loan agreement showing my signature had not been obtained, initiated recovery proceedings and flagged Jason's account for review. Through discovery in the civil filing, the final piece fell into place. Eleanor's apartment had never needed renovation. There had been no contractor, no permit, no scaffolding. She had arranged the fictional renovation as a pretext to move in, had been paying her own rent in absentia during the 4 to 6 weeks, a manageable expense she expected to become irrelevant once the house changed hands. 4 suitcases, because she had never planned to go back. Eleanor faced a civil judgment requiring repayment of the $8,000 plus legal fees. She paid. Her attorney had apparently advised her, upon seeing the folder photographs, to settle without argument. The divorce was finalized in March, civil in the technical sense, which is to say it required me to sit across a table from a man who had let his mother plan the theft of my home, but ended with the house in my name and my name only, which had always been the only outcome that mattered. Jason called twice after he moved out. The second time I picked up, he said he was sorry. I said I believed him, and that being sorry was the least interesting thing he had to offer at this point, and I ended the call. It is April now. The oak tree in the backyard has come back. Small, vivid leaves opened 2 weeks ago, and in the evenings the light catches them through the kitchen window in a way that makes the whole yard glow faintly. I repainted the guest room. I replaced the yellow dish towel. I moved the spice cabinet back to where it made sense. On Sunday mornings, I make coffee with oat milk for myself without waiting for anyone to bring it, and carry it to the porch and sit in one of the old wooden chairs while the light does what it does, which is fall warm and indifferent on everything. On the street below, ordinary life goes past without noticing. The house creaks in its familiar musical sequence. It is quiet. It is mine. I think sometimes about those 5 words, "I don't serve daughters-in-law," and understand now that Eleanor was telling the truth, just not the truth she meant. She wasn't announcing a policy. She was announcing a worldview, that a daughter-in-law is temporary, provisional, a guest who has overstayed, that a woman in someone else's son's house never truly arrives. She was wrong, but she was also, in the end, useful. Because the woman who sat at that table eating cold soup and said, "Fine, a couple more weeks," that woman is gone. Not broken, not destroyed, but genuinely gone. The way a version of yourself goes when it has finally been made unnecessary. Some lessons only arrive dressed as catastrophe. Mine arrived in a cracked bowl pushed to the edge of a counter, in 5 words delivered to my reflection in a darkened window. I would not give them back.